Okay, so this is valve gasket cover and spark plugs. First things first, you always want to disconnect your battery, which we did. We had to replace our battery anyway, so it all worked out. Take off the cover. It was 10 millimeter, I believe, for that one. It's kind of a mix between 10 and 12, I think, the whole day. But anyways, there's a couple of hoses that you have to loosen up on the top. And then there's about 12 screws that you loosen all around the cover, valve cover. So just use a couple of pliers to release the clamps. And then George was using a flathead just to kind of help shimmy off the hoses. They were a little stuck. We just kind of put things aside for safekeeping that we didn't want to lose. Our engine is cold also. We had it sitting overnight, so it wasn't hot when we started. Okay, so these are the ignition coils that connect to the spark plugs that he's touching, but I'm sorry. At this point, he's just removing all the screws. And like I said, there's 12 of them. So this, what ended up happening is, we've been having some emissions issues with the car, and so this was a few things we decided to fix, and at the same time our battery went and the alternator went. So I do have a video that's going to be coming up when we change out the alternator as well. Some of the screws are there's two of them at the ends that are kind of deep down. You just have to either use a magnet or pliers. So here's he's taking out the ignition coils, which that's what connects to the spark plugs. And they were kind of stuck. They were kind of like suctioned in there pretty well. So once you pried those out gently, safely, they are all numbered as well. So for the 4 cylinders, they do have numbers correlating, and they are the length that they need to be to reach the hole where they're at. So it's pretty hard to screw it up, but you do have to be careful of that. There were two more screws on the end, which I think that's covering the timing belt, but anyways, there's a belt under there, but we just had to get those screws off before we could lift off the cover. This is fairly simple. The only problems that we ran into, which I'll talk about probably more when we get to it, was the valve cover was stuck. It's kind of fused on to the engine head or engine block, whatever it's called. But that was the hardest part, was just getting the gasket out, just because it was like our car's 11 years old now. Not too old, but enough. Yeah, here we are trying to loosen up, just super gently taking the mallet to it. We ended up having to use a piece of wood to kind of softly tap, but it took a long time because you don't want to damage the engine block because it's aluminum. It's very, very easy to damage that. So we just kind of shimmied a little piece of wood underneath the edge and just gently used the mallet on the bottom of that to kind of lift where we could. It took us a while, but we got it done. And then we just George just cleaned up a little bit of the leftover gasket that was kind of fused onto that engine head there. So at this point, everything's all open. Like, you don't want to drop anything in. We did use a compressor to start with just to make sure there's no dust or extra dust in the car. You can actually see the ignition coils behind there, which we already had replaced. By the time we're done with this car, we're going to have replaced everything on the engine. We did get rained out. There was a thunderstorm that happened, so we ended up having to go inside for a little bit. And at this point, we're just removing the old gasket. And when we replace the new one, they are rubber, so you do not need to add any glue or anything like that. It seems like there was some glue on the original one. And I just got this part from AutoZone. It's called the Felpro valve cover gasket. I'll put the item number in the description. It's $46.99, so $47. And that's super easy. Just pop that back in. The ones that go around the gaskets that cover like where the cylinders are, like those were hard to get out. They were kind of weird. We ended up like you could pop them out, but that just took us, I don't know why it took us forever to get those out. And you do have to just be gentle. We didn't want to break anything unnecessarily, so it took us, we just were being careful with it. So just pop those new ones right back in. Easy peasy. And then we could just replace the cover. It's fairly straightforward. We could see all of, a lot of oil kind of leaking, and I asked my stepfather, and he's the one that mentioned that's what we needed to do, is to replace that. So pretty straightforward. And we figured since we're doing the valve gasket cover, we might as well do spark plugs. And the ignition coil too, I was like, I thought it might have something to do with some of our problems. Okay, at this point we're screwing back on. We started with that end piece, but we ended up having to do that, take that off again and do it last, because all of the screws and holes were not lining up correctly. So we ended up taking those out and then replacing them at the end. Okay, so we're getting all those 12 screws back in all around. Pretty easy peasy. They do need to be torqued. And it was, I believe, I'll get the exact numbers that you need to have it within. I want to say it was like 3.9 and 5 point something, and we did Newton meters. We had it just under 5. But I will double check on that and put it in the description. And I got the info from Auto Guys out of San Diego. They work on a lot of Hyundais, so I was assuming it was the same. So when you're using a torque wrench, you just want to twist it until it clicks once, and then you just completely stop. You don't want to over screw. And the torque wrenches need to be calibrated, so it's something you need to make sure is up to par. And just replacing those hoses. I don't know why we have some needle nose pliers for that. Okay, that's that last hose there. Needing to attach. And yeah, those are pretty easy. Those little clamps they're kind of getting old on some of them around here, but they work. So now we're just removing the spark plugs. So after some time, we figured out the size. I want to say it was 5/8, but I'll double check on that again. And you just want to gently release the spark plugs. It is helpful, on one of my videos, someone had made a really good comment about the fuel pump one, about torquing the fuel pump when you're replacing it. And it was just really helpful because, we are not mechanics. Obviously, if you have the means to go to a professional, then that's the first thing you should do, just because they're going to do it correct and not risk your life. But we are just trying to save a buck right now, so we've been figuring out a lot of our car stuff ourselves, and it does help when people comment, just because we are, we're not professionals, and we have no ego in this. It's just we're just trying to figure it out as we go. So you can see it's pretty worn down. And the spark, I got everything at AutoZone for for this. I didn't order anything online just because it was like I needed the battery immediately, just because it did stop. So it just kind of went and got it all at the same time. And these spark plugs, you actually do not need to gap them yourself. They come pre-gapped. And it says on there to not gap it specifically. Tells you the Newton meters, 28 Newton meters is what we used, or you can see 21 pounds there. And they're gapped at 0.044 automatically, so you don't have to do that yourself. Then once that's done, you put the ignition coils back in. We didn't change the actual coils, we just did the coil pack, which we may need to do the coils at some point, but, and again, they are numbered, so it's easy to put them where they need to be. It's numbered on the side of the ignition coil pack, and the lengths of the hoses are the lengths that they need to be to like match up whatever hole you're going into. It is very important to put them in the correct cylinder. And just make sure they're snug and where they need to be. There's also arrows on the cover too, so you can know you're putting the correct line through the correct little trail there. So that was that. So pretty straightforward. The next video I'll be doing is the ignition coil pack.